Welcome to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. In this episode, I'm joined by my guests, Tim and Sue Iorio. They've agreed to share their story with us, which focuses on the tragic suicide of their eldest son, Nick. In sharing their experience, they hope to raise awareness of suicide and talking about the devastating impact on the lives of family and friends and their healing process. They're also authors of the book, The Penn State Walk-On, Overcoming the Pain and Legacy of Suicide Through Football, Faith and Family, which tells their story, but I'll let them tell you more about that. So welcome, Tim and Sue, and thank you for joining us. Perhaps we could start by you telling us about you and your family and maybe life before, the tragic events that happened.
Well, I guess I'm going to start. I'm welcome. And we're just a normal family. Tim and I met when we were younger in our 20s. And after courting a little while, got married. And on our first anniversary, we discovered that we were going to be welcoming a little baby. Mm-hmm. And Nick entered into our life 9 months later. I'll let Tim just kind of explain a little bit more.
Yeah, so I think the beginning is that I was going to graduate school in Champaign, Illinois at the University of Illinois. And I graduated, I guess you could say, January 1977. Nick was born in February 11th, 1977. And so from there, we moved back to Toledo, Ohio, which is where we're from. And I guess quickly, Nick, he was quite a guy. He had a spark, and he was a spark plug. And he was going to grade school at Ladyfield, which was run by the Sisters of Notre Dame, a Catholic school. And a lot of highlights, but the biggest highlight in our mind is when he played Scrooge his 8th grade year. He was phenomenal. He practiced the English, dialect. They said it was the best in I guess you could say school history. And then from there, he was a very good student, very good athlete. He went to another Catholic school, an all-boys school called Toledo St. Francis, where my other two sons went, and it's where I went. And got, I guess, the highlight there, he received the Oblate Award, which the Oblates of St. Francis run the school. The Oblate Award, basically, overall, is the number one student overall, as far as academics and as far as an athlete. He also won the Athlete Award. He was, a great football player and a great wrestler. He really had the whole package. Okay,
he
that's
did.
the beginning.
He was a very, I guess you would say, an old soul, because he spent a lot of time with people, and people came to him, and he shared himself with them. And he was kind of for the downtrodden. One of his very good friends was a young man who had some issues, and he later passed away as well, but by a different method. But Nick was always there, and he did well in grade school. He did well in high school, but he was a spitfire. I tell you what, he was a lot of energy. Yeah. In fact, I can remember one time going to the doctor saying, "I'm not sure if he's overactive." And he said, "Well, does he sleep? Does he take a nap?" I said, "Yeah, he takes a really good nap, and he sleeps at night." He goes, "He's just a normal boy." I'm like, okay. He was my first child, so I was learning as we go. And then we did have two other boys. So we had a family of 3 boys, and it was a very exciting, busy time. Lots of sporting events, good students. All 3 of the boys were good students. And that was our early life, I guess.
So from there, great student. He received a scholarship to John Carroll in Cleveland, which is run by the Jesuits. I guess we were very Catholic prone. In one of the footnotes, he wanted to go to Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. And he got on the waiting list. And to be honest with you, he was somewhat devastated. He felt like, I worked so hard, I should have got accepted. He could have got in his second year, but by then it was like all or nothing with him. So he goes to John Carroll. This is 1995. He's playing football, and he's doing real well, like a 3.8. So things are going well, we thought. He was saying, I'm homesick, and Cleveland's only like 2 hours away. And so from there, in 1996, the summer of 96, when he went back to start football, he basically came home, wrote us a letter and says he's not going back and he's dropping out. And we were like, oh my God, what? This all-American kid is dropping out. So we were still young, we were still like 40, 41. And so long story short, we met with his coach and Nick. And, the coach took me aside and said, something's going on with him. That was our first red flag. And still not. I thought, well, okay. So after we got over the shock, then we calmed down and he says, I want to transfer someplace. And so we looked at a lot of schools. Bowling Green State University accepted him in the business school. And that would have been, he was started in I think it was the spring of 1997.
And it was very close to our home.
Right.
But yet he would live there, not at our home. But it was good because he had a hard time leaving St. Francis and leaving our home because his younger brothers and he were very active in sports and his heart was really at St. Francis. And, we being young parents thought, well, you need to go away to school. Mm-hmm. That's what you need to do. So we probably should have kept him a little closer to home, even though it was only a couple hours away, just because he needed that. So when he went to Bowling Green, he was close enough that he could come home. It was 30-minute drive.
Right.
And in fact, he was able to substitute coach, or I guess, I don't know if you call it substitute, but he could coach with his assistant coach, with his former football coach. And his brothers were on the team. So it was great because all three of them were together again.
Yeah.
And he loved it.
Yeah. However, a very key point is this, because we were still part of this thing of we have these expectations for our children. Try not to put a lot of pressure, but there was enough. So in March of 1997, he's going to Bowling Green. We think all is well, but he apparently came home, and I don't know if it was Tim and Joe, but they came into our bedroom and they said, Nick tried to take his life. And we were totally, no, what? Right. And then Nick came home and he basically said, I could not do it because I wouldn't want to hurt you and that. So we knew enough to know that he needs help. And I get chills thinking about it. So from there.
Well, we took him to the hospital and he was evaluated. And I think he admitted at that time?
Yes, he was admitted. And here's another mistake that I made. But, again, remember, we're not sure about all this. And so, I'll never forget it. That was March 3rd, I think, when all that happened. And then the following Monday, my job took me to Mexico. And we said, either I stay back to be home or I go to Mexico to try to make it normal. Well, if I had it over to do, I would not have went to Mexico. So Sue was kind of left with holding the bag at the hospital, which was a very unfortunate experience. And you can kind of talk about that.
I think in some respects, a lot of things have changed since the 90s as far as treatment, mental health treatment. There's new medications. There's more recognition. We talk about suicide. We talk about mental health more than we ever did back in the 90s. It was just one of those things we didn't talk about. Mm-hmm. And we didn't know that much about it, actually, particularly with adolescents. And I'll call him an adolescent. He was a young adult. He was in his 20s.
20.
Yeah, he was 20, but he still was a young adult. And things have changed a lot since then, thankfully. But yet there's still some things that haven't changed.
Well, and one other thing, and we'll get off the hospital kick. Two things. One, he was in with a group of adults. Some were drug addicts. They were adults talking about how you could take your life. I mean, here's a 20-year-old, young guy. And so he's getting this feedback, how to go on disability. And I have to admit, I still thought this young guy is a 4-point student. He's got it together. We think we're going to get through this. Okay. So there were some mistakes made on us, but like Sue said, back then in America, there was like only $6 million appropriated by Congress for research on mental health. So, today that has changed. So I guess now that takes us from...
Well, and the one thing I will say, we learned a lot of what was going on about Nick, not directly from Nick, but through this friend that I had mentioned earlier that he was close to. He told us that Nick was in a support group at the hospital, and he was with adults, and they basically told him, hey, if you really want to be successful, you get a gun, you go take it that way. And we're like, we didn't find that out until after the fact. And of course, we're not gun owners. We've never had a gun. And that doesn't mean that we're opposed to people having guns, but it wasn't in our language, our discussions, because obviously he was a young adult and, they talk to each other. They don't talk to you necessarily. So
now that gets us into, we think we're on mark. We got a doctor, psychiatrist who we knew. He also had a psychologist, counselor, and he was on several medications. That was another thing that if you do research, you get on a couple of these different medications, that can create a suicidal thoughts.
And may I say, this was long before the black box warning came about on these medications, because they were new. The SSRIs, which are a lot of the antidepressants that are popular today, we now know, we did not know then, we now know they can potentiate suicidal ideation. And I don't speak as an expert on that, although I do have some medical background, but that's not my expertise. But we know that now. We did not know that back in the 90s.
So
at the time, did you feel you were losing control?
How do you control a young adult? You want them to be independent. You want them to make their own decisions. You can't keep them in a bubble. You can monitor some things, but we wanted things to be as normal for him as possible. And in fact, when he was discharged from the hospital, we wanted him to go back to school. We wanted him to get back into his lifestyle because we felt that that was good for him.
Yeah. And from my standpoint, what haunts me is I wish we would have had him stay at home and go to the University of Toledo. But because BG was only 30 minutes away, and from talking for me, I felt like things were getting better. And I do remember Nick talking to me. He was a very bright guy, and he was sitting at a bench in front of our house, and we were talking, and he says, "This is not quality of life for me." And I said, "Nick, we're going to beat this thing. We are going to beat it." And so I guess from my standpoint, maybe I wasn't accepting it, but all of a sudden in the summer of '97, Nick, besides being a really good student at Bowling Green, he became an assistant coach at St. Francis, which is where he excelled. And his two brothers, Tim, who's a doctor today, and Joe, who's the Penn State NFL player, was on that team. To me, it was like, are you kidding me? I mean, that's where I went to school. That's where I played ball. And it was like, we're there. We're making it. In the meantime, he's on meds. In the meantime, he's getting counseling, and the coaches were super. They were together. Probably another big mistake we made is we kept it confidential. We thought, well, we're not going to tell our family because we don't want to spook them. And again, the mental health was still one of these, stigma things, So
I think that was something that we wish we would have done a little differently. We did discuss his condition with Tim's sister, because Tim and I and the other two boys, they were still in high school. We took them on a spring break trip, and Nick was going to stay back because he was not on break from university. So we said, we need somebody to kind of watch out and make sure everything's okay. So we did tell his sister, but we did not, and we have a very large family. We did not discuss it with anyone else.
Yeah. So from there, things are going well. The team is really good. Joe was a junior, big guy. Tim was a senior, and he played soccer, and he was the punter. So there were some ups and downs during that time, and his coach used to call us. He says, well, we see some things with Nick. He said, well, he's still going through it. So then It was October 10th, 1997. I'll never forget it. I was in my office. Receptionist came running and says, "You have an emergency phone call." I'm going, "Oh my God." So I get on the phone and it's his friend. And his friend says, "Nick's in big trouble. He's out by the high school. He's in a daze. He's spaced out." I said, "I'll be there." So I get in my car. I zoomed over and here's Nick, walking around spaced out. It was like, no, this is another nightmare. So finally they called a rescue squad, got the police, and he would not go in. And he says, "Well, you're violating my rights." And I said, "No, Nick." So he finally goes in. They take him to the hospital on October 10th. And so I called Sue. Here again, I'm thinking, this is bad, but you know what? We're going to get through it. So then we go to another episode at the hospital. If you remember what the nurse said.
Nick was in the emergency room and he was having some issues, and he got up and got out of the emergency room and ran out of the hospital. And we heard a commotion. We were sitting out in the waiting room.
Yeah.
We heard this commotion and we went back to see that he was gone. And I said to the young nurse, I said, "How could this happen?" She goes, "Well, I have sicker patients to attend to." I'm like, how sick do you have to be?
Well,
now, remember, this was back many years ago when things weren't as they are today, but it tore my heart out, especially because I'm a nurse. And he was sick. He was very sick, but it was a mental health sickness that people didn't quite understand like they do a heart attack or whatever.
So he gets out and he gets back coaching. He's still going to school. The coaches are working with us, which, the coaches were fantastic. So there was a soccer game that Tim was in. It was a district finals, St. Francis versus St. John's, which is a very big rivalry. We never beat them in soccer. At this time, we beat them. And Nick was there. And it was cold. And he had just a light jacket on, right?
Right. It wasn't very far. The stadium that they played this big soccer rivalry game wasn't far from Bowling Green. So Nick was able to come and watch it. And I said to him, "Nick, aren't you cold? It's cold in October in Ohio." And, "Oh, no, he was fine." But he didn't look fine. He looked drawn. He looked tired. He just,
yeah. And from there, we beat them. And I mean, it was a huge game. And Nick runs out on the field and he tackles Tim. Boom. This guy is 6'1", 215, and Tim goes down. And so we're all excited. And so that was a Saturday. Then on Sunday, of course, he was home and, he cooked a nice dinner.
Right. He came home the weekend and we were just a normal family. And he had to go back to school, which was a short drive. And he wanted to go up in his room. He took a nap in his room, and we had he had asked if we could have turkey. So we had a turkey dinner, and it was just a very lovely, lovely weekend.
So then he called later on Sunday evening. This is October 26th. And he said he left his wallet at our house when he went back to BG. And we said, "Oh, no problem, Nick. Then, you come in, you get it." So Monday, October 27th, Sue is going back to work. I have to drive to a small town in Indiana. And it's an amazing thing. I don't know if this was a signal, but I had a brand new Lexus, which was my trophy. And I went into a bank to get some cash, and they had an arm that crashed into my Lexus. I was like, "Oh my God." And I was going to go home, and I didn't. So I drove to Indiana. Very long story short, a meeting with managers and that, and I said, "I got to get my voicemail." Well, on that voicemail was Nick. And he says, "Dad, I'm really sorry. I can't take it anymore. I'm leaving. This is it." I thought, oh my God. I mean, it was even worse than a nightmare. So I call Sue. I said, "Sue, we got a terrible problem." Tim and Nick's friend, they try to go and find him. Sue and I drove most of the evening, remember, in
Right.
the Blazer.
Yeah, we tried to find him. Actually, I worked about an hour from our home, so I had to drive home. And in October, it starts getting dark very early in Ohio. And so it was dark and we didn't know where we were going. We didn't know where he was. We were searching. My family did have a lake house about an hour and a half away. And I said, let's just take a drive up there. So we did. I mean, we were going all over trying to find him because he had gone there a couple times by himself. And we went up there. We couldn't see any evidence that he had been there. Well, we had a slight evidence. There was a strange box on the porch. Now, the lake house was closed for the winter, and it had a screened-in porch. And there was this long box, empty box on the front porch. And that was unusual because everything had been closed down. There was no heat. Everything's closed down for the winter. But I guess we didn't think too much of it. And so we left and came back to our house, the hour and 15-minute drive.
But the neighbor, I think he called your dad.
Yes, the neighbor at the lake house.
All right, and then he heard some pops, boom, 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 boom. And so, and in the meantime, I don't know how soon, I was totally wiped out, totally exhausted, didn't know what to think. And so you talked to your dad and, we're still not sure, personally, I felt like we're going to find him.
Well,
find him alive, quite frankly.
And of course, my dad was upset. He had apparently gone over and talked to the neighbor and asked the neighbor if he had a key to get into the lake house. And the neighbor then realized there was something not quite right and called my father, and my father called me. And that is when I told my father that we had been dealing with Nick's illness. And my father then became quite, concerned. And I tried to explain to him that we didn't know what was happening, but we knew there was something that was not good.
Yeah. So from there, we go home and, now, being strong people with faith, praying our guts out, having people all over the place. A good friend of mine who's a minister in Toledo, so please get him on the prayer list. And things are ticking. Now it's October 28th. And Sue and I, we just said, I don't know where this is. I think we're headed in some danger zones.
Well, if you recall, the friend that I had talked about earlier called us and said that he had talked to Nick, and cell phone use was very spotty back in the 90s. Not good reception. And he said, but he's going to call you. He's going to call you. So we said, great. So we went home and we waited for a phone call.
Well, so then I think it was about 4:00 in the morning. We hear a knock on the door. I open up and it's the police. And again, you're in a state of shock. You still don't know what's going on. Police officer looked at me and he says, you need to call a detective. I think it was in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And so I told Sue, I said, well, I'll call him and called. And it was a female detective. And she says, I'm very sorry for your loss. Now, at that point, I get chills thinking about it. At that point, it's like, what's happening here? Is this a movie? And I looked at Sue and Sue looks and I'm going like that. And somehow Sue kept it together. Did we have a priest there?
Yeah, we did. Actually, that was Ann Arbor was about an hour and 20-minute drive from the lake house. So we were kind of in the right location.
Close.
We realized later what the long box was on the front porch. It was the box for a gun, a rifle. And the pops that the neighbor had heard, apparently our son had been shooting the gun there, but that is not where they found him. And yes, he did take his life using a gun. He was under the influence of alcohol and medication.
Yeah. And the psychologist, when we had talked about when he took off, he felt like, the medication is going to run its course. He's going to be tired and it should be
He'll fall asleep somewhere. That's what we were told when we got this phone call.
Right. And so, from there, there's no really words. I mean, you can call it a nightmare, but there's no words. And we start calling our family. they just exploded with grief. And it was the worst, terrible, no words to describe that particular day. And I think we were in such shock that the adrenaline is flowing, and you know that, okay, we have to start to look at this as now a process, get ready for a funeral to, bury your son. And it's just, so from there, this is October 28th now.
As we mentioned, the mistake we made was we had not really discussed his illness with our family. Mm-hmm. So they were totally in shock because they had no idea that there was anything like this going on. The majority of our family, that is. And neither did other friends. And so it was quite a shock to everyone. And maybe that was a mistake. Maybe we should have been a little more open.
Yeah.
Looking back, I think we should have. I think it takes a village. I know I hate to use that acronym, but it does take more than just yourself. It's the community, and people know each other, and your friends want to be there, and people can help you. Yeah. And it's not something to be ashamed of. Yeah. And it isn't, you just need to share it.
Now in the community, you have to understand that our family is big in Northwest Ohio. We've got lawyers, we've got doctors, we've got the athletes. I mean, Nick was one of the best athletes in the Toledo area. And when that hit the community, they were totally, I don't even know if you can call it shock, because here's this all-American young man, and he's gone,
and you don't expect it.
By suicide, which at that time, again, nobody talked about. Now, dovetailing into that week of October, the week of October 28th, all the way up to Saturday of the funeral. I mean, we could go on and on and on about the dynamics. The two dynamics that stick in my mind, it was Friday of that week was Halloween. And we were playing St. John's again, two of the best teams in Northwest Ohio for the city championship and to go into the playoffs.
In football. In American football.
Yeah. And in Ohio, football is it's just unbelievable. So the coach came to us and said, should we call it off? And we says no. And we talked to Tim and Joe. And of course, they didn't know what was happening. And, they said, no, Nick would want to play. And really during the funeral home, the players from St. John's and the Coach Breyer, who was a good friend of Nick, they came to the funeral home. I mean, you're like, no, this is not happening. And so all week we're going through this. We beat St. John's, then we get ready for the playoffs. And then, of course, there's a funeral on November 1, my mom's birthday. There were 1,000 people in the church. 6 or 7 oblates were saying the mass. Again, we're still in shock. Our adrenaline is going. You're still in disbelief. And I think, your question, Phil, about the control, sometimes as humans, we think we're in control. Well, we're not in control. And even though you have an all-American young man, you know what? That has nothing to do with it. Great accomplishments, but it's the health of your child. So
I guess the moral of that story is it can affect anyone. It doesn't have to be someone who's down on their luck. It can be someone who's at the pinnacle. It's just a mental health condition. And unfortunately, we lost by suicide.
And as far as dovetailing into the book, the Penn State Walk-On, that is the story. That's 1997. And then Joe, who was a tremendous athlete, all state in track and football, big guy, like 6'4", 290, the youngest. Nick was his mentor and coach. And he told Joe, whatever you do, you play Division I football or forget it. So Joe is being recruited by some of the big schools, Ohio State, Illinois, the Ivy League schools like Yale. I mean, he was a great student. He had the whole package. University of Pennsylvania. He was a tremendous discus guy. And Pennsylvania was one of the top Ivy League schools and schools in general for track and field. Well, he had some possibilities as far as scholarships with some of the lower I shouldn't say lower level schools, but like, not Big Ten and that. And he says to us, Dad, I'm going to Penn State, which is a powerhouse, and I'm going to try to get in there. So the book gets into how he became this walk-on, 18 years old, with the number 2 team, in some cases number 1 team in the country, with Coach Joe Paterno, and he's going to walk on. And so, the book talks about all of a sudden the light begins shining. We go from this hell to the light begins shining, and it was a great distraction.
Did you, through that year from, through the year through to October, did you ever think what would happen would happen? Did you ever think that would happen? Did you always think that he would get better and you wouldn't be faced with the situation you ended up being faced with?
Yes, we really did. We thought we thought Nick would get better. We tried to keep life as normal as possible. We learned a lot after he passed, because a lot of people came and told us things that we were not aware of. One story was when he went to Bowling Green, he was living in an apartment with some guys, and he had pledged a fraternity, and the house next door to his was a bunch of girls. And the girls came to the funeral and said, he used to come and tap on our window in the middle of the night. He wasn't sleeping. We had no idea he wasn't sleeping. And there are stories like that. And we had one professor from the University of Bowling Green say, I had no idea. She said he was such a brilliant student. And she shared a story with us where it was kind of Nick against the rest of the class. She had asked a question and he answered the question, and the rest of the class kind of disagreed. And she said, he really had the right answer. And we're like, oh, okay. So, that was right up until shortly before he passed away. So he was doing well and he was hiding it very
well. When we lost him, when we went to the psychiatrist, the first thing I said is, I didn't know you could die from depression or mental health. And so, yes, I felt we were going to, I remember talking to one of his professors at John Carroll, who again, business professor, who again said he was a brilliant student. And I said, well, professor, I thought we were going to beat this thing. He says, I don't know if you ever beat it. That sticks in my mind even today, that mental health, which is part of the holistic being of physical and mental. And when you talk to people that have mental health issues, you say, look, you're going to have to deal with this the rest of your life. What did we learn? We learned a lot. Some of the things we told you about. And in 2018, we decided to write the book. We felt we were old enough now to deal with it. We wanted our 5 grandkids to know who Uncle Nick was. And, here we are, 27 years later, he's still making an impact. I guess you could call it, on the world, with the scholarship at St. Francis, with his plaque, and, with our family doing
and with this podcast as well. It's still, the legacy is alive in this.
And once we began writing it, it flowed very quickly. And it's a short read. It's not a long book, but it explains that, as far as I'm concerned, it kind of tells the story that no one's immune to tragedy. It told the story of how we survived the grief. We worked through the grief. I will say that, and I think I said this once before, we've learned a lot, but we still have a lot to learn. Things have changed, and I'm not so sure they're changed for the better. Maybe the one thing that's improved is that we're not afraid to talk about it anymore. It's out in the open. It's nothing to be ashamed of, and that is mental illness, if I may call it that. There's times in your life when sometimes things don't go the way you want it to, and it's okay to talk to people about it, and it's better to talk to people. And if you are the person that someone talks to, don't feel that you have to be, keep that to yourself, because it's better if you talk to others.
Yeah. His friends, they came back and said, well, we know he was struggling. We knew he talked about, I don't want to be around anymore. He even told Joe that. And they said, why didn't you tell us that? Well, again, back then, you just didn't do it. You don't go to the parents and say that, that something is difficult. And I think another thing that we stressed is the whole maintenance thing, meaning that when you have these situations, particularly with a young person, you have to be on top of it almost 24/7. And I know Sue said, well, how do you do that? But dovetailing into today with, you talk to, Rich, about the police and the firefighters with suicide is off the chart, the military, COVID certainly impacted the young people and the social media right now, that these kids go on the media and they're bullying and they're talking about crazy stuff. And so, and we worry about those kids, not to mention the adults, but, that's the whole point of the book. If you can at least prevent, we're talking a lot about the aftermath, but it's the prevention. If we talk to, like our talks, one quick story, a parent came up to us after we talked in the Phoenix Summit. We had teachers, the left, we had the right, we had the NRA there. It was quite, interesting. We said, we're here to try to do the right thing. And the parent comes up and says, my daughter is a 4-point student and we've seen some changes. And I never forget, I said, well, it's great that she's a 4-point student. Put that aside. She needs to get some help. Doctor, medication, whatever.
Well, and the other thing that's changed significantly is the whole crisis with drugs, and social media, of course, did not exist back then, but that's a whole nother issue. And so, as I said earlier, some things have improved, some things have not improved. Some things have gotten more difficult.
Well, it's interesting because we belong to this church group, and just last night, a lot of them, they were asking, "Oh, I want to listen to this, this podcast," and for some reason, I don't know, maybe I was going through this and felt a little bit tired or whatever, and we were talking about the whole mental health thing, and I said, well, sometimes I feel like, what's the use? You continue to hear about the drugs, the suicides, and yet, and people are saying, yeah, but you know what? You and Sue are making an impact. That's not the reason. Well, we want to help people. And, we always have to be careful about the book. Did we do it for glory? Absolutely not. Did I ever think that we would be, on a podcast like this, giving talks, writing a book or whatever? But our whole thing was, if we can, people complain about society, every day. Well, what are you doing about it? Are you at least doing something? And I think that's what brings us back to, hey, if we can do a podcast, if we can talk to people, listen to people or whatever, that at least, thank God, at this stage in our life, in our 70s, that we feel like, well, maybe we are doing a little something,
So for people listening to this who are maybe worried about a child or a friend's child, or just anyone, they don't have to be their child, or who are parents or who have been through, coming out the other side, what advice would you share? I know you've shared a lot of advice today, talk about it, open up with your friends and family, but what would you say to those people listening now thinking, well, that's me. Either I'm really concerned and I don't really know what to do, and I'm terrified that I'll get that call, or, well, it happened and my world shattered. What can I do now? Where do I go now?
Well, to answer the second question, we did attend some grief counseling. I went a little longer than the boys and Tim did. We went to some support groups, and still maybe once in a while we'll attend a support group. I think you have to talk about your feelings. The fortunate thing for Tim and I is our relationship allows us to talk about that. Sometimes marriages don't survive the loss of a child for whatever reason, or through whatever reason, I should say. I think being able to talk to each other, and of course we do have faith, which has helped us tremendously. So I think communication is probably, don't be afraid to talk to other folks. If you have to get help from medical professionals, then that's what you need to do. you can't bottle it up. Grief is something you can't run away from. You might think, oh, I'll go on a vacation and things will get better. No, it goes with you. You have to go through the various stages and deal with it. And, at some point you'll stop asking the questions, why did this happen? I think that was something that a very wise person told us, that you'll keep asking the questions and eventually you won't ask that question anymore. You have to learn to accept that.
So the two things that come in my mind about, moving forward is that when we went to the support groups, a lot of tragedy. I mean, I think there was one person who lost 2 children, and you start to realize you're not the only one on earth with the tragedy. Because I think when it happens to you, you think you're the only one that's going through a tragedy and the world hasn't stopped. And for me, the significant emotional event was when I met, remember, Joyce, whose daughter was a Marine, and she shot herself. And I remember meeting her, and I never forget, we had coffee and a breakfast, gives me chills. And she was going through what Sue said, you're going to have to take it like Dr. Kubler-Ross said. You're going to go through the anger, you're going to go through the bargaining, all this stuff. And that, I think that meeting made me realize, hey, you know what? There are some people who survived. Plus we had 2 high school kids, junior and senior. And I remember my one uncle said, remember, you got 2 other children, even though you're ready to quit.
And losing a child is, I don't know, for those of people who have children, I always would say, people would come to me and say, I don't know how you get through this. I said, yeah, and you don't really want to know, because which of your children would you give up? And we learned that we were not alone, and there are people that you can talk to, other people that have gone through this, wiser souls, maybe. I think that was our message and our rationale for writing the book, was to let people know that you can survive.
Well, for me, we've had a lot of massacres in the United States, just unbelievable. And the one in Parkland, which I think was in Florida, that the shooter killed, I don't know how many students, 30 or something. And I sat there, I said, you know what, Sue, we have to start coming out with this gun safety. Not only were people taking their life in that, but these mass shootings, something's got to give. So from there, we met with the president of the Gun Safety Association in Arizona, and she said, well, would you be willing to talk about it? So we did. And then,
well, one thing I'll say about the book, we were given quite a blessing, actually. Joe was the first true freshman walk-on to start for Penn State. His start was almost 2 years to the day of Nick's death. It was like someone was up there or wherever helping us, because we were grieving tremendously, and this was kind of the epitome. I mean, we're big football families, and when I say football, I mean, again, I'm going to preface that by saying American football, but the boys were just really into that. We were into that as a family, and this was like an unheard of kind of thing that happened. It was so unbelievable, and there's other little vignettes in the book that you wouldn't believe unless you actually were there, that happened to us. So there were messages along the way. And we really felt that was our faith helping us as well.
And again, as Sue said, football in the United States is like a religion. I mean, in some cases.
For some people.
I guess it's like soccer in Europe and England and all that. But the fact that 2 years later we have this 18-year-old young guy hitting national news, USA Today, New York Times, they did a feature on him, and ABC News were interviewing some of the former star NFL players. And it's kind of like, and you're right. I mean, the faith, I think that was a gift from God. And I think Nick knew it. And so the distraction for those next 4 years, and then when he made the NFL, it was just like, again, it was like a movie. And that's why we call The Light Begins Shining. And when we talk to people, They said when I read those first chapters of what you went through, many would cry and have tears, and then the light begins shining.
So what do we need to be doing better generally as a society? I know things have changed in the last 27 years, but some things haven't, as you said, Sue. What do we still need to do better?
I think that the fact that we recognize mental illness and mental behavioral health issues, I think that's tremendous. I think the fact that we're able to talk about it more openly, and I think that the fact that individuals who are suffering maybe feel a little more acceptable to talk about it. I can tell you back some years ago, I had some really negative comments by different people, and I don't think, and people that were important to me, but I think that that's changed tremendously. I think we still have a lot of things we need to do. We're human beings, and we need to accept one another, and we need to understand that at some point in your life, you may suffer from depression. You may suffer, and that's part of the human condition. Grief is a very difficult thing. And unless you've been struck with tragedy and had grief, and you will, if you're human, you're going to experience grief at some point in time. So,
well, the things that I wrote down, first of all, there's not enough providers. I've talked to people out there, they can't get their children in for like 6 months, and unfortunately in our country, to be a psychiatrist, you're not making $1 million a year like maybe some of the, other doctors or whatever. So that's a concern.
Might I say, and maybe I wasn't clear enough, but communicating with each other. Don't be afraid to talk about it. Don't be afraid. If you hear something, if you believe something's going on, and not that you're going to be a Budinsky, if you will, but share your thoughts and your feelings. And I think particularly as parents, if you see something of another child, maybe it's going to turn out to be nothing, but alert the people that need to know. But people do need to communicate with one another. We need to talk about it. And I am so grateful that is happening more than it did back then. And particularly, I think that's part of Tim and my relationship. He was able to talk about his feelings to me. A lot of men, you're right, can't do that.
And, the thing about it is that, I don't think it like I did 27 years ago, but every day there's a missing piece. Nick, we miss you, and keep saying prayers. And then you get going with your own life, and that's what you hoped, again, that you can add to some people, that, because not only death by suicide for children, but just death in general. Yeah, children, certainly you lose your parents and this and that, but that's in the order that it's supposed to be, right? So yeah, it's quite as I call it, it's quite a journey, not a destination.
Just to reiterate, I don't think men should feel that it's a weakness. It isn't a weakness. It's a human condition.
It's a strength, actually. If you're strong enough to talk about your mental health or your feelings, and that makes you a stronger person, whether you're male or female. I do believe that. So Sue and Tim, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for sharing your story and your journey with us. And I really think it's going to help a lot of people listening. So great pleasure to have you.
Well, again, thank you, Philip. It's just a pleasure. And, God bless that you're continue with this torch that, is needed and will always be needed.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of Midlife Men, where my guests have been Tim and Sue Iorio. Their book, The Penn State Walk-On, is available to buy on Amazon and other mainstream book retailers. If anyone would like to reach out to Tim, he's happy for you to contact him via LinkedIn. If you search for Dr. Timothy Iorio, you'll find his profile. If you or someone you know are experiencing any of the issues raised in this podcast, the general advice is firstly go and talk to your doctor. But there are also organizations you can call now including in the UK, you can call the Samaritans on 116 123. And if you're in the US, you can call the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. If you have a suggestion for a topic you'd like us to cover in the podcast, or if you have a story you'd like to share, then please contact me either on Twitter @midlifemen or email me at midlifemen01@gmail.com. Join me next time when we talk to other midlife men about their stories, and maybe you'll find that they resonate with you. Thank you.